Jan Öberg. Mr. Öberg, thank you very much for being on the show.
And my point is that the last 20 years or so, basically since Olof Palme died and since the EU membership of Sweden, Sweden has stopped having an independent foreign policy. We have come very close to NATO without a formal membership application yet. This has happened basically without any public discussion. There's not a wish to have a public discussion, which was originally Sweden's basic policy, that everything we did in terms of common security, neutrality, disarmament and all that was something that was anchored in a public discussion, and the Swedes would know what their country was standing for. So I think this loyalty among elites is a problem, because we need a public discussion, a much more intensive discussion about whether to join NATO or not, and how we get Sweden to contribute again to disarmament, including nuclear abolition.
Minister Carl Bildt, who played a very hawkish role, I have to say, in the Ukrainian crisis. You'd think that Sweden is more fervently pro-NATO than some of NATO's founding members. How do you explain this sudden shift from neutrality to de facto interventionism?
Well, it's good you're taking up the neutrality, because we are formally non-aligned in Sweden, but neutrality was scrapped long ago. The argument was that after the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, you could not be neutral because there were not two parties to be neutral between. This, of course, is intellectual nonsense. We could still have neutral states who would be helpful, for instance, as mediators in the international conflict areas around the world. So how did it happen? Well, there were people who wanted Sweden to finally say goodbye to everything that Sweden originally stood for and get closer to the United States and NATO. This was run particularly by the Social Democratic Party and Prime Minister Göran Persson and Foreign Minister Anna Lindh at the time. It was a policy shift, simply. Well, that's a combination, of course. I mean, Carl Bildt is not responsible for the overall change of Sweden's position on international affairs. But at the moment, of course, of the last 6-7 years, he's been the foreign minister and a former prime minister, too. I have been surprised myself, because it's not really statesmanship to compare Russia with Nazi Germany in the case of Ukraine. And a very hawkish attitude also, and an ill-founded attitude to the question of Georgia in 2008. But I do not like to see foreign policy in general as just run by individual interests. There is an influence, of course, from that. But this is a political, ideological struggle. And as I said to you, if the argument is that you can't be neutral, you cannot have your own policy anymore, you must belong to one camp, you know, it's a very limited intellect that decides that. If what you have on your shelves are fighter airplanes and a lot of militarist equipment, then that is what you choose rather than intelligent conflict resolution. To put it crudely, if you only have a hammer in your toolbox, you will see all problems in your home as something that has to be hammered down. It's a global problem. There's something called the military-industrial media-academic complex. This is structures outside democratic control, as Eisenhower said already in the 50s. Denmark has participated in wars all over the place since 1999, when we bombed Yugoslavia. We've been occupying power 4 years when the present Secretary General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, was the Prime Minister of Denmark. We are in Afghanistan. We were a major bomber together with Norway in Libya. And we were the only country, together with France, who thought that it was a good idea to follow the American idea of bombing or intervening militarily in Syria. These interests are money interests. They are very close allies between money people, corporate people, and politicians. They are supported by the majority of the Western so-called free media, and there's nothing to be surprised about. What I'm concerned about is that it always are small people around the world who pays the price for these policies. And I don't think that we can have a democracy if we continue to have the MIMAC, the military-industrial media academic complex. It goes against democracy, because you go out in any street anywhere in the world and what people want is peace. But what they get is militarism instead, and military conflict resolution, which never solves the problems in the first place. You look at Iraq, you look at Afghanistan, you look at Libya, you look at Syria, you look now, wherever you turn, where military has been used and war has been, the solution, things are worse today than they were before. My foundation is working for the norm of the United Nations Charter, which everybody has forgotten and violates, from east to west, north and south, that peace shall be established by peaceful means. The Charter of the United Nations is a Gandhian charter built on the idea of scrapping war, abolishing war, and when humanity has problems with each other, we negotiate, we talk, we consult, we facilitate, we treat each other as human beings instead of bombing each other. That people are arguing we need to join NATO today when we don't have a Cold War and we don't have a Soviet Union and we don't have a Warsaw Pact, whereas they could survive as neutral states when these things existed. This is bizarre to me. I mean, this is pure propaganda. The Russian military expenditures are 7% of NATO's. Now, if we could survive as neutral states together with Switzerland, Austria, Finland, and Sweden at the time, with our own defenses and not being part of NATO, I wonder why on earth we at all need NATO today when the Warsaw Pact has disappeared. Secondly, I also wonder, how could we survive at that time when tension was much bigger, when there were much more nuclear weapons in Europe, etc.? So, I mean, this is bad intellectual thinking, but I tell you, the ministers of foreign affairs and defense and prime ministers, at least here, are spending more money on spin doctors and marketing their unintellectual views than they do on listening to experts and people who happen to know something about these things. It's part of a propaganda war. I have always been against confrontations, humiliations, speaking down to people, threats and all that, because it doesn't help conflict resolution. There is not one minister in Europe who has advisors who know something about conflicts. They may have international lawyers, they may have military expertise, diplomatic expertise to advise them and guide them. They have nobody who knows about nonviolence, conflict resolution, conflict psychology, or anything like that. Mm-hmm. While there are tons of military academies and research centers in both your part of the world and our part of the world, there is no peace academies. Mm-hmm. You can go on like that. There is no resources set off for creating peace by peaceful means. Mm-hmm. So what I would like to have, rather than continuing a long discussion about military threats and confrontations, is to say, and that's what peace research is about. That is like a doctor saying, how will we create health instead of continuing to have a disease? That is to discuss what security and defense is the next 30 to 40 or 50 years. And it is not something we can provide in any country with military. None of what faces humanity, east, west, north, and south, none of it can be solved by military means or fighter aircraft or satellites or nuclear weapons. Military is outdated. It should go like cannibalism and slavery and child labor. It doesn't belong to civilization. The last 20 years, Sweden has definitely, in all indicators, politically, militarily, technically, etc., moved closer to the US and to NATO. So close that there are people you will hear in Sweden now who says, well, why don't we get married when we're anyhow living as fiancés? And so it is presented sooner or later will be presented sooner or later as the only option. And that is why the threat from Russia is needed. You know, most people think that you make an objective analysis of threats and then you build your defense according to what threatens you. It's the other way around. You have a military, industrial, media academic complex, as I mentioned, and to have that running, you construct your enemies. There is a clear hesitancy in the Swedish population about the full membership, and that has to do with two things. It will be very foreign and very difficult for anybody to persuade Swedes that Swedish troops should operate militarily abroad in a crisis situation, paragraph 5 of Article 5 of NATO. Secondly, it will be close to impossible, I think, to persuade Swedes to accept nuclear weapons. And if you join fully, you become responsible for NATO's nuclear policies. And as you know, this is great reason for hesitancy among the people. But you can still threaten. There is something called fearology. If you make people believe that certain countries are going to swallow you tomorrow, you can make people accept almost anything. And it is that propaganda that I'm trying with my foundation and my colleagues to stand up against, because intellectually it's not correct, it's not truthful. If you run wars all the time here and there, it becomes a kind of normal thing. The other thing is that media are doing a great disservice to humanity by always covering war but never covering peace. We don't have conflict journalism, we have war reporting. We have nobody who is interested in peace building and how countries solved their problems before without weaponry and without warfare. This is a disease. The drama of war is so fascinating for media, and many media are owned by corporations that also produce weapons, and you see the circle of this media MIMAC complex that I have mentioned. So yes, but there is one good change, and that is that wars between countries has gone down statistically, whereas we have an upsurge in internal violence in many countries, and there you have the argument of humanitarian intervention. That if you have no reason to use weapons anymore, if you can't find a raison d'etre, a reason to exist, then you say, oh, we need the military to bring in humanitarian aid and stop genocides and things like that. The first nonsense about this was Kosovo, where the idea of a humanitarian intervention was sold, of course, falsely, because it had nothing to do with the genocide there, although there were violence. I was a mediator there between Serbs and Albanians for 4 years, so I know that place quite well. But there was not a genocide planned. What the Americans did was to build the Bond-Steel base 3 months after the bombing of NATO in '99. I think you have a kind of normalization of violence. You train young men in violence. You have violence in the media. You have violence in the entertainment world. You have violence in books. You go into any bookstore in the world, most of the books will be about history and wars. You can go on like this. We're living in a militarist culture, and we don't even see that we are. If you take Syria, if you take Libya, we could have solved these problems. I know it's a provocative statement. I'm sure we could have solved these problems without weapons. But what do? We pump in weapons from all sides and believe that that helps anybody. Now you have 160,000 dead people and millions of refugees. That's a result of that. It is part of the Christian culture to divide things into two, left wing, right wing, male, female, them and us, and etc. I've always argued, with a little smile, that we ought to have more Hindus and Buddhists and atheists doing conflict resolution, because they are able to see things as not divided up in two, but maybe in 30. There were not two parties, the Serbs and the rest in Yugoslavia, for instance, but that's how it was interpreted. Now we see again the confrontational binary, as you say, the West versus Putin and Russia. And it's always this, there is only these parties. There's the good guys and the bad guys. And, there is no conflict in the world where all the good sides is on one, all the good guys are on one side and all the bad guys are on the other. This is propaganda, and this is deep culture. It is something we're not aware of is not true, because I don't think that all journalists are militarists or want war. They are simply not aware that conflicts are much more complex and may have 30 parties and not two major. It was a coup d'etat attempt in Kiev by the West. And all these sanctions, which is now, have no relevance in this case. Sanctions is not a tool. It's not a tool in Iraq. It was not a tool in Iran that serves any good purpose or conflict resolution.